Good morning. Welcome to the Northpoint of View here with Dr. Walter Kemmsies. Walter, good morning.
Good morning, Mark.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Hey, let's talk about communication. You know, and you and I've studied it. We've talked a little bit about it. Obviously, there's layers to it. And then in terms of communication with and without bias, and I know that both of us try to, communicate and especially what we're doing here with an absence of bias. But let's face it, we start our day every day with bias, right?
Yeah.
Or for the most part, we do. I mean, there's certain things in our lives, our experience, that lead us to a place where we start from every day that's different from other people, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of a baked-in bias. You do a really good job of trying to filter the bias out, especially when you're communicating. I know your critical thinking sort of begins way out here and drives you to a point, but talk us through some pieces of that.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I work in a lot of consulting assignments, and one of the reasons I get picked is because I have no political bias. Nobody, neither, regardless of which party is in control of what kind of agency or infrastructure or asset, they don't want a politically biased answer.
Right.
So don't tell us what if you want me to tell you what you want to hear, there's some other consultants, I can give you their names, but I'm not good at it. Yeah. It's one of the reasons I enjoyed working for the Georgia Port Authority for years. I was always told, you can say what you really think. You are allowed to be wrong, but we need to know what you really think. And every so often you had to deliver some unpleasant news, and
right.
And the reaction is always going to be negative to that.
Right.
And then it's corrected. But nobody takes good news well. At least I don't, and I know practically nobody who does.
Bad news always gets a reaction, right?
Exactly. And so I've always tried to be very, very neutral. Early in my career, I didn't like the president at the time, and my views of what was
that FDR?
No. It was FDR. Thanks so lot, Mark. Look, I still...
It took you a minute where you were like, no, it wasn't FDR.
You're like, wait a minute. What? You ambushed me there. But anyways, I didn't like him. And my view of the economy and my expectations turned out to be quite wrong. And it wasn't because he was Republican or Democrat. I just didn't like the guy.
Yeah.
And that's another interesting thing we got to talk about. But from that point on, I swore I would not be in favor of either party. And there's stuff that each party has that I like, and each party has stuff that I don't like.
Right.
So it's kind of easy to be neutral when you try to be. Now, it doesn't mean that, like you mentioned, we're all biased. Deep inside, do I have biases? Yeah. You might call me a more conservative economist than a liberal one, in the sense that I'm always trying to see if the market can do something. We just talked about this in the last several weeks. But that's one thing. But here's an interesting thing that, well, maybe it's not interesting, but I'll tell you anyways. I taught
that should be the title to this podcast.
I'm going to tell you anyway.
It's interesting. Well, even if it's not, I'm going to tell you.
So I was a professor at the University of Memphis for 7 years.
Yeah.
And I've had very high ratings. They at the end of every semester, you hand out a student survey. The students would fill it out, and they would give it to the dean's office or whatever. And I consistently hit 90 to maybe 92% high approval, straight A marks for everything. And then there was a, 5 to 10% sample that just nasty. I mean, they gave me really low marks. And I always wonder if, I looked at the distribution of grades, and the distribution of grades didn't,
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Is it 92% of the class got A's and 8% got F's?
Exactly. You bastard. Anyways, they weren't correlated. And this went on for 2, 3 years, wow. 4 years. I'm like, wow, this is this is really...
That is actually interesting.
Yeah, it is. I thought, So years later, I'm at UBS, and we have a corporate finance head, and I was asked to participate in a few projects, that they were offers that they were getting involved in, pitching for. And it was an Indian guy. I don't remember his name, but super sharp. I mean, just really beautiful mind. And I asked him, why do you have so many of us coming? I mean, we almost outnumber, like 20 of us going in to meet with our target. And I said, there's almost more of us than there are of them in the room. And he goes, you'll notice I throw some people out. I go, why? And he goes, 1 in every 10 people looks at you and hates you on sight. Just not hates you, but dislikes you on sight, just for no known reason.
Interesting.
And I thought, nah. But then I noticed that, started looking more closely, and I remembered about the students grading me and how I never got a 100% mark. I thought that was, one of the biggest learning things that, in my life.
Well, that goes back to that Malcolm Gladwell book, Blink, where when people see something, and his example in the beginning of the book is a piece of art, is a statue, mm-hmm. and that there's almost an instantaneous valuation that you place, your mind processes the information that's given. Mm-hmm. And again, it was a wonderful sort of introduction to the concept, but it was that, 95% of the people thought that this, just in a second, that the value of this statue would have been in the tens of millions of dollars because the trappings and all of it. Mm-hmm. And at the end of this introduction, it was a fraud. It was worth $100, but somebody had paid $15 million for it. But it was because of the way it was presented. Mm-hmm. And so that instantaneous evaluation of an object in so many times just based on visual information resonates exactly with what you're talking about.
That coincides with something else. My work does not look pretty, as you know. When I put a PowerPoint together or a Word document, you need to get somebody with media skills to go make it look right. I mean, I don't notice the difference from one slide to the next. Oh, you jump from font size 12 to font size 14. It's like, no,
you're looking at the data and everybody else is looking at the visual presentation.
Exactly.
You're looking at the information behind.
So you get these beautiful presentations that are full of absolute baloney. And you can tell that at least a third of the time was spent on the visual. And I've always used that third of the time to get the answer right. I mean, when you work with infrastructure, there's no room for error. You've got to get it right. If you build too little, you lose a lot of business and you create bottlenecks for the rest of the gateway. If you build too much, then you can't afford to pay your debt, and you go bankrupt. And that doesn't work either. So trying to get it in that right range, and infrastructure is a long duration asset, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I'd rather put the time into getting it right. But the problem is if some guy just does some baloney on a spreadsheet in 5 minutes and then spends 2 months making it look gorgeous, he's going to be believed before me. And I do see that a lot in my in the consulting work that I do.
It's true. I mean, there's a lot on social media right now. Obviously the visual aspects of things, what people think is attractive, and in my mind, we've been in sort of an unhealthy period now of sort of what that means and how far it is skewed in my mind. But there's just no doubt that in communication, mm-hmm. the visual aspect is a piece of it. And I'd never heard the 1 in 10 just look at you and evaluate and say, whatever it is.
Yeah, I don't care.
It can be the color of the shirt, which again, thanks, I won't wear the pink again. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things, socioeconomic and race and gender, ethnicity, all of that it's crazy, but it's baked in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think there are some people that do a lot better job of being intentional to filter out bias, and I think you're one of those, and I think that's the reason that so many people, call you, email you, try to enlist you to give your perspective and opinion on things, because you do a great job of filtering out or trying to filter out the bias.
Yeah, exactly. And I was lucky when I was in the PhD program back at Texas A&M. We had Bob Baseman, who Dr. Baseman invented two-stage least squares. When you run a regression, x against y, fit a line through it. Well, sometimes you don't have the correct y that you need, and so you have to sometimes run two regressions. One regression, get a model, and then use that model to make the second regression work. And he invented it during World War II. It was part of military strategy. That was the single biggest invention in statistics since the 1600s, when they invented regression. And so we went to study under him. And one of the things first thing he said is, he goes, "You're very smart, but you're not intelligent." And so he made us take a whole year of symbolic logic, truth tables. And I don't know if you did it as an undergrad, I didn't, but we were handed the books and we had to learn how to do truth tables. And until we could do those, he did not want to talk to us about statistics. And then I went to the statistics department and I took the PhD sequence of courses there. And one of the things they made us do, the exercises we did, was to get medical articles, medical research, and read it and then explain why the methodology was incorrect. And because of Bob training us in symbolic logic, I nailed every one of those exercises.
Yeah.
But that was very good training. And that's what I try to bring to bear when we do these infrastructure planning, et cetera, is try really hard to, get rid of all of these little things in your head and just work with the facts, make assumptions where you have to because you have no other choice. There are no known facts. And then use the truth tables to come to the logical conclusion.
It's a reminder of a great story. When I was in college as a junior, I was rolled into a sort of a higher level class, and the professor was a guy named Dr. Robert Hatcher, and he happened to be the president of, it was a geology course, it was advanced. He was the president of the U.S. Geological Society at the time he was giving the class. So wow. He was sitting on the mountaintop.
Yeah.
And he was he's a serious guy, right? And I was, a little bit intimidated to even be in the classroom. But we were on a field trip, and it was, master's levels and PhD level students as well. And we're in an outcrop in the Appalachian Mountains, and we're looking at some rock formations, and he picks up something from the ground and starts handing it to the students and asks if we can identify what it was. And everybody was stumped. I mean, everybody's looking at this piece of black sort of rock material. It's like, well, is it, like volcanic from around here? It's like nobody could, it was just, everybody was stumped. And after about 5 minutes, nobody even had a reasonable explanation. He said, "It's a piece of asphalt. We're 15 feet from the road. It's a piece of asphalt that's been chipped off and rolled into the ditch." Use some common sense, right? And it's one of those truth table things that's what reminded me of, is there's some pieces of what's going on that you should be able to just sort of change your perspective and open your lens up to take in more information, that you can become too narrow in your assessment, which is that bias, right?
Exactly.
So that to step back and, hey, if you're 15, 20 feet from the road, it might just be a piece of asphalt.
But on a slightly more serious note, one of the things that I run into with the media is incredible bias.
Yeah, well
just to start with the basic things are just bad communication.
Yeah.
the growth rate of something dropped. And the way the headline reads is, the level dropped. And that miscommunication from the media can really confuse a lot of people. And I don't know why editors of all kinds of media, Wall Street Journal, Journal of Commerce, all of them, aren't a little more rigorous in some of those things. Because I used to be an industry strategist at UBS, and there were 72 industries categorized into 10 sectors. And I had signed up for research and articles for all of them. I had to know what drove the margin in every single industry. And I formed views on everything. And then I would get newsletters and other commentary, et cetera, that would come into my mailbox, and I would sort it into each of these 10 folders. And I still have that today. It's been 20 years since I was at UBS, but I still have that way of looking at the economy. And what I do is, in order to read all of that stuff, you don't really read it. You read through the headlines and just try to see if something is happening that you didn't anticipate, that just doesn't make sense. It's
right.
Like, wow, And so I get upset when the headlines are are not written correctly, because I stop and I start reading an article, and what I really need to do is I want to get through 100 newsletters a day, and I can do that in less than an hour, maybe even in half an hour, as long as I don't get stuck reading too many of the articles.
And you're right. I mean, there's so often you take a look at something and it's like, markets collapse. Uh-huh. And then you get to the third paragraph and it's like, the Dow was down, 0.1%. And it's like, wait a minute, that's not a collapse.
Exactly.
That's barely a speed bump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's precisely the issue. So,
and it's irresponsible. It really is.
Yeah.
For the media to.
But then again, I made a living from that, and I probably still do, because confusion is what drives demand for consulting.
Confusion and chaos in the markets is what makes us money.
Oh, my favorite thing, just going back a bit, there was this thing in the Wall Street Journal about how oil and stock prices were correlated.
Yeah.
This was back in 2006, 2007. I was still as a stockbroker, analyst kind of guy. And they had this chart on it, and it showed over the previous, 5 years how oil and stock prices went up and down together. And so I had a client who came back and said, could we use your oil forecast, which mine tended to be relatively accurate, to try to backtrack in the market? And I go, well, you would never do that. And he goes, why? Because they're not correlated. He goes, yeah, look at this Wall Street Journal article. So I went and I got data that went back 20 years, and guess what the correlation is? 0. There is no correlation.
Yeah.
And once I sent him the data, and I just said, look, some amateur pulled a little bit of data and wrote a baloney story. And the client just thanked me, and it was nice. We got some commissions, but it was a good way. That one really stuck in my head. I just couldn't believe somebody would do that. It was one of the worst articles that for the investment community.
So moving forward, we're going to try to bring you guys unbiased communication, although we walk into the room every day with a little bit. I don't know, fireside chat with Walter. It's been great, man.
It's been great.
Enjoyed it.
See ya.
You guys have fun.